Smooth start. I love a smooth start. I want to talk to you today about the weird and the power of weird.
Weird.
You seen this slogan before? Keep Austin weird. Portland, Oregon has a similar slogan. There are various places that do. Usually, when we think about weird, we think about bad, something we don't want to associate with. But the people that want to keep Austin weird are saying something a little bit different. They're saying there's something special and different about this place and we want to hold on to it. The people in Portland, Oregon are saying the same thing. It may not be for everybody, but what they're saying is that weird is sometimes good. There's a power in weird.
Okay.
We're going to talk about a story today that everybody in the Western world knows. Literally everybody. I don't think you could walk into a shopping mall or a car wash or a McDonald's and people wouldn't know something about this story. Especially if you grew up in the church and you spent a lot of time sitting in pews or in Sunday school classes. You know the story of the wise men. You know the Christmas story. Sometimes, though, I think that a story like this can become so familiar and we can become so comfortable with it that we lose track of the weirdness in it. I want to reclaim the weirdness just a little bit today because I think there's some things we can learn from the weirdness of this story. Now, we all know that there are starting. We all know that there are some mysteries about the Christmas story and about the Christian story in general that we just can't answer, right? Things we just don't understand.
Oh, yeah.
How is it that God himself empties himself somehow of divine faculties and gets put in a body just like ours? That's a strange thing, right? I mean, there are other stories out there in the ancient world about gods having sons, but they usually involved gods having sons sort of the way that we do, and the gods were misbehaving, and the children are usually something half divine about them. But this idea that God himself would somehow become like one of us and be like us, but also be fully God is a mystery. We can't comprehend it.
That's right.
We can't even comprehend the fundamental transaction he came to do. Why is it exactly that Christ had to die for our sins? Why couldn't God just pardon us? Those seem to be popular these days. Why not just issue a pardon? I don't understand that. And the interesting thing is God doesn't seem all that desperate to have me understand that. He tells us this is how it is, and then we can choose to accept or not accept that this is how it is. When we get to the story of the wise men, there are also some mysteries there that I can't fully explain. I want to identify a couple of them. I want to talk about maybe what they mean, and then we'll all go eat lunch. Okay? How does that sound?
Okay.
All right, let's read the story first. We're going to read the whole thing. It's not that long. You know it already. This comes out of Matthew chapter 2. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for from you will come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and determined from them the exact time that the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him." After hearing the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went on ahead of them until it came to a stop over the place where the child was to be found. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after they came into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after being warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. Anybody heard that story before?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, the first thing that we need to figure out is, who are these guys? Now, they gave birth to one of the great Christmas carols of all time, right? We just sang it. We Three Kings of Oriental. It's an awesome song. That first line is probably wrong in every single way. Probably. We don't know that there were three of them. The Bible doesn't say. We know there were three types of gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Doesn't mean there were three of them. We don't know. Kings, they were almost certainly not kings. And they probably weren't from the Orient. Put all that aside, the first line is great, and I love the song, but they weren't kings. Who are these guys? Well, the word that's used only appears twice in the New Testament. I'm not the Greek scholar here. He's sitting over there. So if I get something wrong, he'll let me know. But it appears twice. Once it appears in Acts when there's this guy named Elymas the magician. It's the same term that's used here for these magi. It could just mean a magician or a sorcerer. It's possible these guys were magicians. Maybe they traveled around doing card tricks and birthday parties. But in light of the fact that they are ushered directly to see Herod, in light of the fact that they're bringing extraordinarily expensive gifts and they traveled a long way, that's not very likely. So who is it that these guys probably are? Most likely, they are of this group from Babylon and then Persia,
Yes.
who studied the stars. They studied astronomy and astrology. In those days, there wasn't really distinction. We draw a distinction, right? You have scientists who figure out things about the universe. They're astronomers. You have people who write horoscopes. They're astrologers. We see the two as different things. In that day, they really didn't. These are guys who studied the stars and it was believed got some wisdom from doing so. They were very prominent. They were very rich. They may very well have been advisors to important people. They certainly were carrying expensive gifts around. That's probably who these guys were. Now here's the thing. The Babylonians, at this point, were gone. The Persians at this point were gone. So if they came from the east, they weren't coming from Nebuchadnezzar. They weren't coming from Darius. They were coming from probably the Parthian Empire. Now, anybody heard of the Parthian Empire? So on the left-hand side, we see the Roman Empire. Okay? Everybody's familiar with the Roman Empire. You can't read the Bible without coming across it. And the truth is, the Roman Empire was extraordinarily important in the Western world. We get all kinds of things, including our system of government, legal system, derived from the Romans. But look at the Parthians. The Parthians took over the area that had been the Babylonian Empire. Before that, it had been the Persian Empire. And the Parthians, while we don't talk about them today, were a very, very big deal. This was the only other superpower in this part of the world. You had the Romans and you had the Parthians. They clashed all the time, and the Parthians were very big and very strong. We'll see in a minute that there are some other things about the Parthians that might be important. So, my best guess is, and I think this is what most scholars would agree with, these guys probably came in from the Parthian Empire, and they were in some sense descendants of the Magi from the Babylonian times and the Persian times. They were engaged in the same sort of arts, looking at the stars to figure out information, and they still retained riches and importance. That seems pretty logical to assume, okay?
Okay.
Now, there's some other characters here, and I bring this up, and I'm just going to admit it to you right now, right? I'm something of a Roman history nerd, okay? I really like Roman history. Now, some people here may like it, and you're going to enjoy the next 5 minutes. Some people may not, but here's the thing. I promise I'm not doing this just because it's my hobby. There's actually something really interesting, I think, going on that will help us, all right? And so, one of the other characters mentioned here is Herod. We've all heard of Herod, yes?
Yes.
I want to talk about how Herod got into his position just for a second. And I want to do that because if we understand how Herod got into this position, we might understand a little bit more about how people might have viewed a trip of very rich, very powerful, very important people from the Parthian Empire walking into Jerusalem. Okay? I think it's important. So here's what we're going to do. Oh, and I'll show you pictures too. I know, history is boring. I'm going to show you pictures. It'll be exciting. Here we go. Ready? Picture number one. Not a photograph. We don't have photographs, but this is picture number one. These guys joined together in around 60 BC. They created what's called the First Triumvirate. You don't have to know that. Here's what you have to know. This guy on the left, Marcus Crassus, richest man in Rome. Very, very important. Here's the thing. You want to know what kind of guy Marcus Crassus was? Marcus Crassus was the kind of guy who found every opportunity to make a buck, and he made a lot of them. So ancient Rome was filled with buildings. They just stacked buildings on top of each other, all made of wood. Everybody had to cook and heat their homes with oil. Now you can imagine, this is something of a dangerous combination. Fires in Rome were commonplace. And once they started, with all these wood buildings densely packed, once they started, they could very easily sweep through the entire city. Very, very dangerous.
Yes.
In fact, remember Nero fiddling while Rome burned? About a third of Rome burned that day. So these fires were a huge deal. The Romans, though, hadn't figured out that it would be a good idea to have a fire department. They didn't have one. You know who had a fire department? Marcus Crassus had a fire department. And you know how he used it? Marcus Crassus and his guys would show up when a fire started. And they would say something like the following. It's a nice building you're about to lose. And all your neighbors here that are standing watching this, they're about to lose their buildings too. It'd be a shame for you to get nothing for all those nice buildings. Why don't you sell it to me right now for a small price? And he would undercut them dramatically on price. They would take it because they were about to lose everything, and then he would have his fire department put out the fires. And Marcus Crassus became a gigantic slumlord, okay? That's Marcus Crassus. I'm going to talk about him again in a second. Fantastic guy. All right, in the middle, Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Now, Pompey the Great is a little bit more well-known than Crassus, although not as well-known as the guy next to us. Here's why Pompey matters. In 63 BC, Pompey is sent to the east by the Romans to conquer the east and get it settled for Rome. Pompey is the guy that takes over Judea for Rome. Okay? So in the Bible, when you see that the Jewish people are under the thumb of the Romans, it's because Pompey sent his guys there. He came in with his legions, and he did what he wanted. Now, while he was there, he meets a guy called Antipas. Or Antipater. He has it goes by two different names sometimes. He's a rich guy, a noble in that area. He's an important guy. Antipater and Pompey become friends, which is really good for Antipater. And the reason it's really good for Antipater, in fact, we got a picture of him too. I promised you pictures. The reason it's really good for Antipater is because Antipater then gets a really important government position because Pompey puts him there. Okay? You with me so far? I promise this is going somewhere. Promise. Okay. So, Marcus Crassus, that guy, decides to fight the Parthians. And he takes Roman legions into Parthia. And the legions get wiped out and Crassus gets his head cut off. Okay? Bad news for him. Bad news for him. Good news for the Parthians, maybe. That leaves these two guys, Pompey and Caesar, as the two guys who control the Roman world. Right? You want to guess what happened between those two guys? Not surprisingly, they have a falling out. So, if you're Antipater, Herod's dad, this is Herod's dad, what happens? He becomes an important official in Rome after Rome conquers Judea because Pompey puts him in that position. And then all of a sudden a war breaks out, a huge civil war between Pompey and Caesar. Who does Antipater back? You tell me, who does he back? Pompey! That's the guy he knows. And Pompey at the time was more famous and more accomplished, arguably more accomplished, and he had the Senate behind him. It was a safe bet. But what happens? Who wins that one? I think everybody knows, even if you don't know the story. Who wins? Caesar. That's why we know his name and we don't really know Pompey's name. Caesar wins. If you're an Antipater, that ain't great. Okay? Can we agree on that? That ain't great. So that's the oops. So at the last second, Antipater changes his side. Once he sees that Caesar's going to win, he switches at the last second. Okay? This is what Herod's dad does. Switches at the last second. Pompey runs all the way to Egypt. Caesar follows him all the way to Egypt. When Pompey lands in Egypt, boom, head chopped off. He's gone. There's only one man in Rome. Okay? You follow me so far? Famous guy. Famous guy. Powerful guy. Now, Caesar could go back to Rome, but he doesn't. He stays in Egypt. And he meets her. I'm not sure that's a real picture.
Yes.
I suspect the real Cleopatra didn't hang out with a lion right there by her throne.
No, I don't think so.
But Caesar goes and he meets Cleopatra. You probably heard of her.
Oh, yeah.
Decides to hang around for a while. Has a son with her. And while he's there, decides to meddle in Egyptian affairs. Okay? So this is what he does. He decides, you know what? I think Cleopatra is being treated badly by her brother. And so let's get rid of him and put Cleopatra in as the ruler of Egypt. Okay? Sounds reasonable enough. Doesn't you look like the ruler of Egypt? The only problem is Caesar didn't have much of an army there. And so when he does this, he gets himself in real trouble. And he's sitting in the palace, surrounded by mobs and the rest of the Egyptian army, and he's almost certainly going to die. Okay? Not a good thing if you're Caesar. But a really good thing if you're Herod's daddy, right? And what he does is he then marches down to Rome to help rescue Caesar. This is a good idea. This is a good career move. He helps him, and then Caesar puts Antipater as the governor of Judea. Okay, that's Herod's dad. That's how these guys get in power in the first place, because Caesar put him there. Okay, we good so far?
Yeah.
All right. Now, it's good to have Caesar as your friend, right?
Okay.
Up until they put 27 knives into Caesar. And at this point, it becomes a most unfortunate thing, right?
Yep.
Caesar is assassinated. So now the guy who put him in place has now been assassinated by a group of senators. That's bad. So now Herod's daddy has a problem. Herod also has a problem because Herod is also now a government official in this area. They don't know what's going to happen. But we know what happens. What happens after Caesar dies? There is another what? Civil war. Another one. Huge one. Okay? Fought between guys named Octavian. He becomes Caesar Augustus. Right? You've heard of him. And Mark Antony. You've heard of him. Famous dudes. They're way more famous than Brutus, Cassius, and the rest. You know why? Because they won. The other guys died. All right? So Mark Antony and Octavian... they win the Civil War. Octavian goes to Rome. He rules the western side of the empire. Mark Antony goes to Egypt, where he rules the eastern part of the empire. Now, Mark Antony meets her, and he gets in a relationship with her and has some kids with her. So she keeps popping up in the story, always the same way. Antony and Cleopatra became one of history's great love stories, right? They make movies about them, this and that. Here's the problem. So Herod now becomes friendly with Antony because he's the Roman official that's most important in this era, right? He becomes friendly with him. Now, he needs to because another bad thing happens to Herod. Herod at this point is essentially taken over from his dad, but the Parthians, remember those guys?
Yes.
They come in and take over Judea. And for about 3 years, they have control. Herod has to flee and go to Rome. And when he goes to Rome, he says, I need help. And the Romans say, fine, we'll put you back on the throne. And so Mark Antony and Herod go and get the Parthians and push them out of Judea. And when they push them out of Judea, now Herod becomes king. That's the title that the Roman Senate gives him, king of Judea. Okay? We good so far?
Okay.
So he has a really important, powerful friend, Mark Antony, which is a really good thing for your career at this point in time, right?
Yeah.
Right up until the point when what? What do you think happens next?
Brutus kills.
Things are looking good. Another giant civil war. Mark Antony and Octavian decide they hate each other, and once again, the Herod family is on the wrong side of this thing. He sides with Mark Antony. Antony was a better known general. He was the one that was in place. He's the one this guy knew. Giant civil war. Who wins the civil war? Caesar Augustus or Mark Antony? Caesar Augustus, right? That's why we know him. That's why he has the name Augustus. He wasn't called that until after D-Day. Okay, bad news. What happens then? Well, what happens to most of Mark Antony's supporters is they get killed, right? That's what happens to most of them. And you know, that's not a bad policy, because when Julius Caesar won that civil war, he started giving pardons to everybody. And then a few years later, 6 years later, they all stabbed him and he died. And so Octavian says, I ain't doing that. I'm not doing that. Let's just kill him. Herod, though, is very crafty. He convinces Augustus that he should be left in place because he's the indispensable guy. He will do what Rome wants, and he will be a good friend to the Roman people and to Octavian, Caesar Augustus, right? That's what he does. He survives. He's very crafty, this guy. Now, here's the question. What's his job? What is Herod's job as the Roman installed king of Judea who owns his life and his position as Caesar Augustus? What is his job? Tell me, what is it? What is it? His job is to keep the peace and remit the taxes. That's his job. The most important thing he can do in his life is keep Caesar Augustus happy and hope there's not a new civil war. Keep Caesar Augustus happy. And the way he keeps Caesar Augustus happy is he keeps things peaceful and calm in that area, and make sure that he collects all of the taxes and sends them off to Rome. If he does that, he gets to be wealthy and powerful and rich and hopefully live a long life. If he doesn't do that, what happens to him? What happens to the people that Caesar Augustus becomes displeased with? They die. That's it. That's his job. Okay? So he flips his allegiance to Octavian like his dad did before him. This is a family strategy. It works. He keeps his head. He keeps his throne. Make sure you do right by Rome, because if you don't, it's all over. Now, I bring that up and I talk about the Parthians because I want you to understand something about, about these visitors. You have some rich, powerful guys from the Parthian Empire, Rome's enemy, the only substantial enemy Rome has at this point in time. Walk into Judea, go to Jerusalem, and start talking about how there's this new king of the Jews, and the Parthians, of all people, can't wait to get there to meet the guy. Now, if you're Herod and you hear that, is Herod excited about this news? Does this sound like something that will keep Herod's head on his body? Okay? Because think about it. Let's say these guys stir something up. He can't trust the Parthians. How could you trust the Parthians? Why would the Parthians want to come worship the king of the Jews from Herod's perspective? Parthians a superpower. They're not going to bring some important people in to worship some baby in Bethlehem. Herod looks at it and says, oh my gosh, this is insane. But you know what he's really worried about, I think? We're going to talk about Herod more next week. But you know what I think Herod's really worried about? If these guys from Parthia come in and they stir up trouble and they say, here's a king of the Jews over here, he can probably help you get rid of the Romans. And maybe they support it. Maybe they support it with money. They brought some with them. In fact, they left it behind. And maybe trouble starts. Now, maybe this rabble then knocks Herod off his throne. Maybe. But that's not the only thing he has to worry about. The other thing he has to worry about is Caesar Augustus having to commit huge amounts of resources and troops to go here to quell a rebellion that Herod's job was to stop in the first place. That was his job. It was his primary job. Do not let things get out of control. I know how you Jews are. I want you to stop. This is Caesar Augustus' perspective, right? And imagine the discussion he has with Caesar. Caesar says, let let me see if I understand. So the Parthians, this is like the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War, right? They say,
Oh, yeah.
okay, so some Soviet officials come over, that's what you're telling me, and they start talking about how there's some other ruler of this place that I'm the ruler of, and they leave them a bunch of money, and they make a big fuss about it, and you did what about it?
Nothing.
Problem, right? Problem, okay.
Yes.
Now, I bring that up because I want you to understand the context in which all of this happens. When we hear the story, when we sing the song, sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the fact that this was an extraordinarily dangerous thing. This is not three really nice kings with long beards and everybody loves them and they travel the countryside handing out candy and then they show up and everybody thinks, oh, isn't that swell that these kings came to visit us? No! These are officials from Rome's enemy, Rome's most important enemy. They just killed one of the most powerful Roman rulers in the world recently. They took over Judea 20 years before, probably at this point 40 years before. These guys are bad news. Caesar Augustus does not like them. The Romans do not trust them. And a bunch of rich, powerful magi come in and start talking about a different ruler. That's dangerous, people. You understand what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
It's hugely dangerous. This isn't a cute story. This is, holy smokes, what's going on?
Mm-hmm.
That's why Matthew tells us that all of Jerusalem was troubled. All of Jerusalem should have been troubled. Because this looks like potential trouble where Roman legions come in and start killing people, right? This is dangerous stuff. Okay. So, with that context in mind, I want to go through a few lessons we can draw from this story now that we understand the context a little bit more. I'm going to start with the most obvious one, and then we'll move to some that are a little bit more complicated, a little bit more difficult, okay? Number one. Lesson number one, God wanted outsiders to be a part of this story. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal to us maybe because the story's so familiar and we grow up in a Christian country or what we've always thought of as a Christian country. And so everybody we went to school with a long time ago was a Christian or claimed to be one. It doesn't sound like it's revolutionary. It's revolutionary to the people in Judea at this time. Look, these were people who were looking forward to the Messiah. The Jews of that day were looking forward to the Messiah. Why? Because the Messiah would be a friend to outsiders? No. Is that what they expected?
No.
They thought, it's going to be great when the Messiah gets here and we can be really, really friendly with all these Gentiles. That's not what they expected. No. This was a Jewish king coming to redeem the Jewish people. This was not a story of outsiders. And it's not by accident, I don't think, that this story appears in the Gospel of Matthew, which is the gospel that is the most Jewish of the Gospels. It was written to a Jewish audience. You see, from the very beginning, there's a genealogy so they can show Jesus' connection to the Jewish people. Over and over again, Matthew is talking about Old Testament scriptures. This is a Jewish book written to Jewish people. And the number one lesson that you get in Matthew at the very beginning of chapter 2, right at the beginning of the document is, this is a story that doesn't only involve you. Yes, it's a Jewish story. Yes, it's incredible for the Jewish people. Yes, this is what God promised our ancestors, but it's not just for you. That is a revolutionary idea. And thank God for that, right? I mean, this is a big deal to all of us. We wouldn't be here in this place, okay? That part's obvious and it's very, very important. This is a situation where God wanted outsiders to be part of the story. I'm sorry, let me...
Sounds like I was a week ago.
Now, from this lesson, there are a couple different things that are important to understand. One is that there's obviously a lesson to the Jewish audience that Matthew's writing to that they need to understand. That God included others, outsiders, people they would not have liked and not would have wanted to be around as part of this story. It's very important. But I think it goes beyond that. God's sending an important message to his church. Right? I mean, They're the ones that are going to be reading this gospel and trying to apply the lessons. And remember, in the early days of the Christian church, there were huge problems with this issue of outsiders. And what do you do with them? These people are weird. They eat weird things. They have weird traditions. They do things that we find despicable. I don't like them. I don't want them here. I don't know what to do about them. That was a problem for the early church, right?
Yes.
And at the very beginning of Matthew's gospel, he's sending a message to his church that God wants them. You might not want them, and you might not know what to do with them. God wants them, okay? This is hugely important. And it's interesting that God chooses the very beginning of the story of the Messiah. It's probably not within days. It's probably months or maybe even years for them to show up. But it's at the very beginning. God doesn't decide at some later time. Maybe we'll throw some Gentiles in the mix. From the very beginning, this is the plan. And he has these people involved. He invites them into his work to send this very important message. Does that make sense? Yes. Lesson number 2. This is where things start to get weird. I'm sorry. It's where things start to get weird. Okay. I'll tell you what I find strange about this. Who he chose. Right? He didn't choose foreigners who happened to have been studying the Jewish scriptures, and they traveled to Jerusalem to learn more about it, and they talked to the scribes, and they talked to the priests, and they talked to the Pharisees, and everybody says, let me help you understand the scripture. This is what we're expecting. That's not what happens. Foreign astrologists? Are you kidding me? A bunch of weirdos that, now maybe they knew something about the Jewish faith. There were Jews that were in that part of the world. We know that because they were taken there by the Babylonians. They were the Persians. They had an important role with the Persians. There were Jews in that part of the world, and maybe they understood it. But I note that the Bible doesn't say that they figured this all out by looking at the Jewish scriptures. It's not how they figured it out. How'd they figure it out?
Stars.
They're looking at the stars. Now, that's not a very Jewish way of discerning truth. To be astrologers and spend a bunch of time looking at the stars and figure out what's going to happen as a result. That's not Jewish. Arguably, this is something that God would be displeased with. I think the Jewish sources may be a little bit, certainly sorcery is something that God had been very clear about. You're not involved in that. These guys were, in some sense, sorcerers. Either way, this is strange. It's a strange group of people to pick. You pick some people who, it appears, were involved in something very Jewish and probably non-godly. And somehow, that leads them to God's plan. That's weird, right? Are you with me? Isn't that weird? That's not what I would have expected. I can virtually guarantee that is not what the Jews of this day expected. That people were going to find the Hebrew God by doing some astrology and then showing up saying, yeah, God invited me and he sent a star to direct me. That is not something they would have expected. That would have been very, very strange. Now, we don't know exactly what the Magi understood. We know they said that they were coming because the king of the Jews had been born. Did they understand that figure to be divine? Maybe. They said they wanted to worship him, but the term could also apply just to the sort of obeisance, bowing down in front of a human king. It can be. And so I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know if they truly understood what was going on when they left. I'm not sure. Here's what I do understand. God will accept the Gentiles on his terms, not ours. That seems clear here, right?
Yeah.
This is also a hugely important principle. Why? We talked about it just a second ago. The church was going to be in a position where they had to figure out what to do with these weirdos. What are they going to do with these people? They're strange. They eat weird stuff. They do stuff they shouldn't do. What are we going to do with them? And God's answer from the very beginning of this is, I'll figure out how to incorporate them. I don't need your help. Thank you. I think that's what he's saying. It's a very important concept. God's saying, I will reach the Gentiles how I want. And I'll bring him into my story how I want. Because it's my story. And I can do it. Okay? That's a big deal. And it's an important lesson to the early church, one that they were going to need to learn. It was a difficult lesson to learn, but it's one they needed to learn. Now here's where things get really weird, and I don't know what to do about this. I raise it just because I don't know. Does this mean that astrology thing they were doing worked? Or are we suggesting that God decided to go tinker into astrology to reach these particular guys? I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. Now, what I do know is that the gospel writer doesn't see fit to explain that. It's one of the mysteries that, at least in my mind, goes unexplained here. And again, God doesn't seem to be in a hurry to let me know what the answer is. Probably because the main point of this is, I'll bring the people I want and I'll reach them the way I want, and you better be okay with it. So, I don't know what to do with that, but I find it strange, and it gives me something to think about. It gives me something to think about for the same reason that we were in our faith builders just a minute ago. We're talking about how in Romans, Paul is writing that people have no excuse because God is giving them the information they need somehow. And maybe, just maybe, if we're not doing our jobs very well, or if there are people there that we never can encounter, maybe God finds a way to reach them through their own culture. I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. I don't. And I bring it up only because it's such an odd thing that somehow these guys, I mean, it's not exactly reading the horoscope and showing up, but it's not. I mean, it's odd. It's odd to me, and I don't know what to make of it. But it seems to me that God can do what he will, and he can reach the people he wants to as he will, and we need to be okay with it, right? That's an important lesson here. It does seem to me, though, there must have been something about the way they read the stars. Here's how the Bethlehem star is depicted in art much of the time. That star is about as high as, a 747 flies, and it's got a giant spotlight that just, boom, right on the house, right? Mary and Joseph couldn't sleep for a year and a half because there's this giant spotlight constantly flooding their house with light. It's like living across the street from the Griswolds when Clark turns on the lights, right? I'm not convinced that's what it looked like, okay? Now, out here in this part of Texas, where there's not as much light as you might see in Dallas or Los Angeles or other places, you can see a lot of stars. I've never seen a star. I've literally never seen a star that rested over a house. And I'm not sure that's what happened. I could be wrong. I'm speculating. We all are. I'm just saying. I think that these guys use their astrology stuff to make some assumptions and reach some conclusions about this star that just happen to be true. But there's no reason to believe that everybody in the area of Jerusalem saw that, right? I mean, when they go and ask where, Herod says, where's this baby to be born? I don't know. Maybe check out the gigantic spotlight that's shining on that little house over there, right? That's probably not what happened. So I don't know what to do. I'm not drawing any conclusions other than to say that God does what he does, and sometimes we may not understand it, and that may be okay. I will also say, another conclusion I would draw from this, the Magi themselves are just not that important. We learn very little about them. God doesn't even tell us exactly where they're from. They're just some dudes from the east. How many were there? Where exactly they're from? Right? We don't know. They're a bit player in the drama. Because as important as that may have been, and as rich as they may have been, they weren't the key players here.
No.
Right? They're bit players. They're character actors. God gives them a purpose in the story, and they fulfill it, and we don't know.
Right.
Now, lots of people since then have tried to fill in the information. This is from the cathedral in Cologne, Germany. If you've been to that cathedral, I have. They say that the wise men are buried there in Germany. And they have names. I think Balthazar and Melchior and something else. And there's this story. One of them's supposed to be from China, which is the Orient. I'll concede that. Not sure that's where he was from, but that, right? And they have this, and they put him in this fantastic, beautiful, golden shrine thing. Why? I mean, maybe it's because that's the three wise men. Or maybe it's just because in the medieval world, if you had relics, if you had bones, and you could say, well, these are the bones of an important saint, lots of people would show up and give the church money, and then you could build things like that. That's my guess. But what I find interesting in the scripture is we get very little information about them. We know they're outsiders. We know they're doing something that's very non-Jewish and wouldn't be traditional for the Jewish audience. And we know God chooses them, and we know very little else. Right? That's what we get.
We don't know where they left.
We do know, we do know when they left that they disobeyed Herod.
Yes.
And I think you'll probably talk about that next week. Last one, lesson number 3. God's plan is a threat to the established order, but not the kind that people were expecting. This is what's interesting. Because when Herod looks at this story, from the viewpoint, Herod was raised Jewish, but I think we can agree he probably wasn't the most godly guy around, right? Herod's interested in other things. He's interested in wealth and power and keeping his head on his shoulders. That's what Herod wants to do. And when Herod looks at this story from that perspective, he says, boy, this looks terrible. It's a potential threat to me. It's a potential threat to Rome, which is also a potential threat to me. I need to do something about that, okay? Next week, he'll talk about his monstrous response. But what I want to know is, or what I want you to show is, this was the common response to Jesus throughout his life. The Jewish leaders of that time also saw Jesus as a threat, and frankly, they were in a similar position to Herod, which is, if this guy keeps stirring up trouble, we're going to have a problem. The Romans will come in and crush us, get rid of us, maybe kill us. Who knows what will happen? We can't have that. Pilate was in the same position, wasn't he? Pilate's no different from Herod. Pilate looks at it and says, I don't understand why these people are talking to me about this. I don't care about this guy. I don't care about this issue. It's all stupid. I don't care. But, I'm not going to get in trouble with Caesar. And because I'm not going to get in trouble with Caesar, I better deal with this in a way that makes it most likely to keep the peace and keep the taxes flowing, right? So, this is a common response throughout Jesus' life, but here's what I want to say. Well, let me ask it. Was Jesus a threat to the Romans? Was he? Because everybody seemed to think so. Was he a threat to the Romans?
Yes.
I think so, but not the kind of threat they expected. They were concerned about a different type of threat. Uprisings, revolutions, political assassinations. That's the sort of thing they were worried about. That's not the threat that Jesus posed. You're familiar with this passage. The Pharisees went up and plotted together how they might trap Jesus and what he said. They sent their disciples to him along with their Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are truthful and teach the way of God in truth, and do not care what anyone thinks, for you are not partial to anyone. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it permissible to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? They're putting Jesus in the trap, right?
Yeah.
And Jesus' brilliant response is, in perceiving their malice, he says, why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the poll tax. They brought him a denarius. He said to them, whose image and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, then pay to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And hearing this, they were amazed and left him and went away. Jesus not only extricates himself from the trap, but he also says something really important, something that people didn't necessarily understand, but it's become very important to us since then. And that is that there's God's kingdom and there's man's kingdom. And they ain't necessarily the same thing, okay?
Okay.
The threat to Rome wasn't that Jesus was going to overthrow the Romans. He wasn't going to overthrow Augustus or Tiberius or Nero, and neither was the early church. That wasn't the threat to Rome. The threat to Rome the threat to Rome, the threat to Caesar, the threat to the chief priests, the threat to Herod, the threat to Pontius Pilate, is that Jesus was putting them in a secondary position. You're not as important as you think you are. Your authority is not as important as you think it is. Your ability to act is not as important as you think it is. There's something more powerful and more important than you. I don't need to displace you. You do your job. I put you there. But there's something more important and more powerful than you, and people owe that their primary allegiance. That's the threat to Rome. And that is a very different way of looking at things than the Romans looked at things. The Romans' view was, hey, worship whatever God you want. I don't care. Just understand, I'm in charge. And if you do something I don't like, I will come in and I will burn your towns and I will kill all of you. That's the Romans' position. And God's position is, you're there because I let you be there. But there's something more important than you. And as important as you think you are, Caesar, you are not me. And your kingdom is different and lower and inferior to mine. This is the threat to Rome. It's not one they understood. It's not one that Herod understood. Okay? But that's the threat. Now, all kinds of things come out of this idea. I mean, Christianity eventually gives birth to things like civil rights and equality under the law and separation of church and state and all this stuff, right? All this stuff we know. It comes out of this. The Romans didn't understand any of that, and maybe they didn't need to. But this was a threat to Rome. And it was a threat to all earthly authorities, because God's saying something very different to them than they expected. And that is, I'm greater than you, and my people have an allegiance to me that's greater than their allegiance to you. They don't intend to overthrow you, but I matter more than you do. Okay? Now, listen. This means something else too. Because this is a timeless challenge to the church, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a timeless challenge to the church, because it's also telling us that our job is to focus on the more important kingdom as well. It's easy to get wrapped up in the things that are going on. We live in kind of a wild world right now, right?
Oh, yeah.
Crazy things going on, people saying crazy things and doing crazy things. And there is a tendency for human beings to always focus on the human things. Part of what we see here, the challenge that Jesus makes to the authorities, is not to overthrow them, and it's also not to focus exclusively or even primarily on them. We have a higher calling, and if the church is to get hijacked by the same concerns that Herod and Pilate and Caesar and the chief priests had, the church is missing the mark. Do you hear me right now?
Uh-huh.
Okay?
Uh-huh.
Just as there are two different kingdoms with two different purposes, one higher and more important than the other, one demanding more allegiance to the other, the church's job is to focus on that one, not the lesser one. Okay?
That's right.
I don't know that we're all doing that these days, but that is in fact the lesson. And by the way, one of the reasons I went through that crazy chronology of what was going on at the time is because we don't get the excuse that, well, yeah, that's the way it works in normal times, but I mean, things are really crazy now. Things are dire now. Maybe.
Yeah.
You tell me things are crazier now than they were then? Where you're constantly having civil wars and invasions, and you have these nut jobs that have absolute power over life and death. They can knock down your cities and sell you into slavery. And it happened all the time. All the time. Don't tell me our world is crazier than that one. It is not. We don't get to make the excuse that, yes, the church needs to be focused on God's things, but for right now, when it's dire, we need to focus on man's things.
No.
You don't get that opt-out. It's not one God gave us. Okay? And that means that in some sense, Christmas is an annual reminder to stop focusing on the things of man and start focusing on the more important, timeless things of God. When we remember what Jesus did for us, when we remember the Christmas story, what we're being told is there's something more important than the day-to-day. There's something more important than Caesar. There's something more powerful than Caesar. And I want you to be focused on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stand with me. Something to think about. Yeah?